In the summer of 1942, the fate of Europe hung in a fragile balance. The war on the Eastern Front had already consumed millions of lives. Yet neither Nazi Germany nor the Soviet Union had delivered a decisive blow. What unfolded along the Great Bend of the Volga would determine not merely the outcome of a campaign, but the strategic trajectory of the entire Second World War. In this alternate course of history, the name Stalingrad would not become a symbol of German annihilation, but of a grim and costly triumph that reshaped the war. Germany's southern strategy in 1942 was driven by necessity as much as ambition. The failure to destroy the Red Army in 1941 had left the Wehrmacht overextended and bleeding. Oil, not ideology, now dictated operational priorities. The Caucasus fields promised the fuel required to sustain the German war machine. And the Volga River served as the artery through which Soviet industry and logistics pulsed. Stalingrad, bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself, stood at the crossroads of symbolism and strategy. To seize it would be to sever the Volga, shield the Caucasus flank, and strike a psychological blow of incalculable weight. As German Sixth Army advanced toward the city in late summer, the Luftwaffe unleashed devastation on an unprecedented scale. In this version of events, German air superiority proved more durable and more ruthless than history recorded. Soviet fighter units, depleted and poorly coordinated, failed to contest the skies effectively. The bombing did not merely reduce the city to rubble, it shattered Soviet command cohesion and disrupted the early flow of reinforcements across the Volga. River crossings became death traps, choked with wreckage and exposed to relentless air attack. The Red Army entered the battle already at a logistical disadvantage that would only deepen. The street fighting that followed remained savage beyond measure. German infantry advanced block by block through factories, worker housing, and shattered administrative buildings. Yet the crucial difference lay in tempo and coordination. The German High Command, learning from earlier mistakes, resisted the urge to rush piecemeal units into the maelstrom. Instead, assaults were carefully sequenced, supported by concentrated artillery and close air support that Soviet defenders increasingly lacked the means to counter. Where historically the battle degenerated into chaotic attrition, here it unfolded as a brutal but methodical reduction of Soviet strongpoints. Soviet resistance, though fierce, began to fracture under the weight of sustained pressure. Commanders such as Chuikov still exhorted their troops to cling to the western bank of the Volga. But ammunition shortages grew acute. Reinforcements crossing the river arrived in diminishing numbers, many never reaching the front lines at all. German forces gradually pressed Soviet units back toward the river's edge, isolating pockets that were systematically destroyed or compelled to surrender. The psychological effect was profound. The city that bore Stalin's name was slipping away. By November 1942, the Germans stood in control of the vast majority of Stalingrad. In this alternate timeline, Soviet counteroffensive plans suffered from critical delays and intelligence failures. The Red Army still massed forces on the flanks, but German reconnaissance detected the buildup earlier than expected. Crucially, the Axis allies guarding the flanks were reinforced in time. Additional German anti-tank units, redeployed from quieter sectors, stiffened Romanian and Italian defenses. When the Soviet Operation Uranus was finally launched, it encountered resistance stronger and more cohesive than anticipated. The encirclement that had doomed Sixth Army in reality never fully materialized. Soviet spearheads achieved local penetrations but failed to link up decisively. German reserves, though limited, were committed with precision, sealing breaches before they could widen. Luftwaffe transport aircraft, not yet crippled by catastrophic losses, maintained supply corridors to forward units. The Germans did not escape unscathed, but they held their ground. Stalingrad remained in German hands. With the city secured by early 1943, the strategic consequences became immediately apparent. German forces established firm control over the Volga crossings, effectively severing the river as a Soviet supply route. The impact rippled far beyond the ruins of Stalingrad. Industrial output in central and southern Russia suffered as raw materials and finished goods failed to reach their destinations. The Red Army's southern fronts began to feel the strain, with shortages of fuel and ammunition undermining offensive capabilities. Equally significant was the psychological shock. The Soviet Union had endured disasters before, but the fall of Stalingrad cut deep into the regime's carefully cultivated narrative of resilience and inevitability. Propaganda struggled to mask the defeat. For the first time since the dark days of 1941, doubts crept into both military and civilian consciousness. The aura of Stalin's infallibility was subtly, but unmistakably, diminished. For Germany, the victory brought both relief and renewed confidence. Hitler proclaimed the capture of Stalingrad as a turning point, a vindication of his strategic vision. Across occupied Europe, Axis propaganda seized upon the triumph as proof that the Reich remained unstoppable. Neutral states took note, recalibrating their assessments of German staying power. Yet beneath the surface, the victory concealed enduring vulnerabilities. The battle had still exacted a fearful toll in manpower and materiel. Losses Germany could ill afford in a long war. The Caucasus Campaign, bolstered by the secured northern flank, progressed further than in actual history. German and Allied forces pushed deeper into the oil-rich regions, capturing additional infrastructure before Soviet demolition teams could render it useless. While production never reached the levels Berlin had hoped for, even partial access eased the fuel crisis that had plagued the Wehrmacht. Panzer divisions retained greater operational mobility through 1943, altering the balance on multiple fronts. The Soviet response was neither collapse nor capitulation, but grim adaptation. Faced with the loss of the Volga corridor, the Stavka redirected resources toward alternative rail and road networks, stretching an already overburdened system. New defensive lines were constructed further east, and the Red Army intensified its emphasis on depth and elasticity. Yet the timetable of recovery was altered. The massive counter-offensives that historically defined 1943 were delayed, scaled back, or launched under less favorable conditions. At Kursk, the consequences of Stalingrad's fall were keenly felt. German forces, benefiting from improved fuel supplies and a more secure southern flank, entered the battle with greater cohesion. The Red Army still prepared formidable defenses, but its margin for error was narrower. The resulting clash remained one of the largest armored engagements in history. But its outcome was less decisively Soviet. The Germans failed to achieve a breakthrough. Yet they withdrew in comparatively better order, preserving combat power that would otherwise have been lost. Internationally, the altered course of the Eastern Front reshaped Allied strategy. In London and Washington, planners reassessed timelines for a second front in Western Europe. The Red Army, no longer surging inexorably westward, could not be relied upon to bear the overwhelming share of German strength indefinitely. Calls for accelerating operations in the Mediterranean and intensifying strategic bombing gained urgency. The war became a contest of endurance even more starkly defined. Within Germany, the victory at Stalingrad postponed, but did not eliminate, the reckoning between reality and ideology. The regime pointed to the captured city as evidence that sacrifice still yielded reward. Yet the demands placed upon the German people continued to escalate. Total war, once a slogan, became a lived experience. The absence of a catastrophic defeat delayed internal dissent, but it also prolonged the conflict, ensuring that eventual losses would be borne over a longer and more exhausting span. For the Soviet Union, the loss of Stalingrad hardened resolve as much as it wounded pride. The state tightened its grip, extracting ever greater resources from its population. New commanders rose through the ranks, shaped by defeat into cautious, relentless practitioners of operational art. When Soviet counter-offensives resumed in earnest, They did so with a colder appreciation of German resilience and a renewed determination to grind it down. City by city, river by river, in this alternate history, Stalingrad did not mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Instead, it became a grim testament to the cost of victory and the price of delay. The war in the East stretched on with altered rhythms and recalibrated expectations. Millions more would die before the balance finally tipped. Yet the capture of Stalingrad ensured that the path to Germany's defeat, when it came, would be longer, darker, and far less certain than the history we know. The Volga flowed on, no longer a lifeline for Soviet resistance but a silent witness to a moment when history turned. Not toward immediate redemption, but toward prolonged and merciless struggle.
Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into alternate history fascinating,